Welcome to our second lecture covering the Family and Medical Leave Act. In our first lecture, we did an overview of the FMLA. We discussed the reasons that an FMLA leave should be approved, and we talked about the amount of leave time that an employee is entitled to. We've been focusing really exclusively on the non-military FMLA. We'll talk about the military leave in our next lecture. For this lecture, though, we'll be talking about employer and employees' rights and responsibilities with respect to the FMLA process. Again, in future lectures, we'll talk about the military FMLA, the enforcement process that exists for both military and regular FMLA, and USERRA, the Uniform Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. USERRA is obviously not part of the FMLA, but because we're talking about the military FMLA, I thought it might make sense to hook the topic of USERRA on. USERRA is a really, really interesting topic. We will spend a little bit of time on it because it's not going to make a huge impact upon your client's business, but it is important to at least be familiar with some of the aspects, and frankly, they're quite surprising. So this part of the next lecture may be the single most surprising part of the course for you. I'll tell you a couple stories about that when we get to that section. Okay, so let's talk about employer responsibilities. And then, of course, we'll talk about employee responsibilities. So what does an employer have to do? Well, lots and lots of things. And an employer has to give very specific notices, many of which need to be in writing. And there are very specific deadlines for this. You can't wing FMLA compliance. You need to have a well-oiled machine of having people who know, oh yeah, those magic words were said, or those magic words could have been said. And so therefore we've got to do blank, blank, and blank. And it needs to just process seamlessly. Everybody knows kind of their part of the process. That takes a lot of training, and it takes a lot of forethought to nail this. Most employers aren't there. There's a tremendous amount of liability lurking out there for plaintiffs' attorneys to take advantage of. So if you happen to work on the plaintiff side, wow, if I were a plaintiff's attorney, this is where I'd be investing all of my time, because this is where there are so many compliance issues. And even a really, really conscientious employer is not going to be perfect in this area. Okay, so let's look generally at the employer responsibilities. One is to provide a notice to the employee of the employer's plan to count the absence as an FMLA event. We'll be talking about this in a lot more detail. This is the concept. If you're going to count FMLA time against the employee, you got to tell the employee, and you got to give the employee very specific notices by specific dates. Another thing that you have to do is you have to maintain the group health insurance at the active rates for that employee. The employee may choose not to participate or continue to participate in the plan. So you have to have a plan B, because even the non-participating employee has some rights, and we'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. Then, of course, you have to restore the employee to essentially the same job that he or she had before. There's a little bit of flexibility. It doesn't have to be exactly the same job, but it has to be pretty darn close. And so if you're not going to put the person in exactly the same job, you have to think very carefully about that. Then there are a variety of records that have to be maintained, and of course they have to be maintained in a confidential manner. So lots of details here that can take up a very significant amount of time. In addition, you have to apply general notice to employees about how this particular employer is going to address FMLA. And one of those is going to be a poster, and the other is going to be a notice in an employee handbook. Now, not all employers have employee handbooks. So if the employer doesn't have a handbook, then this needs to be distributed to the employee whenever the person is hired. Also, website postings can make a lot of sense as well. Let me just pause here. Let's talk about the poster. Then I'm going to show you an example of the poster. So again, electronic posting is fine. The notices, though, do need to be posters. And if you fail to make the posting, there can be a fine of up to $110 per willful violation, and that every day would be a willful violation. It's hard to imagine a non-willful violation of any length at all. So not a huge amount of money, but still some money in play here. And again, if you happen to have a portion of your population that is not English speaking, then you'll need to make sure that you have the poster in that language as well. The poster is available from the DOL in Spanish. There may also be other languages that it is available. Let me show you. Here is the poster. Again, you don't have to pay for the poster. The Wage and Hour Administration of the Department of Labor gives you the poster for free. So you could just print it out right here and use this particular poster. And again, as I said, they also have it posted in Spanish. The problem is that there's so many different posters that you're going to need that it becomes very cluttered looking, and it's easy, for one to be taken down accidentally or intentionally and nobody to notice it. And so that's why I do recommend the all-in-one posters. It's not very expensive. Usually they're about, 30, 40 bucks to get those. And you don't have to worry about it at least for a year. So it buys you a lot of peace of mind. But if you choose not to go with the all-in-one poster approach, you certainly can post these. And this is the one that the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Administration, which is the agency that administers this law, provides for those purposes. While I'm here, I'm going to show you a few other resources that you might want to be interested in. And again, if you are interested in looking at the website, to actually get this, you'll see the link up here, the URL up here. So here is a fact sheet. This can be a really handy tool to use to educate your client. So your client isn't thinking you're an alarmist when you come in and say, oh my gosh, you're doing this completely wrong. And this can also be a good tool to kind of present it in fairly layperson's terms. This gives an overview of how the process works. On the other hand, if you're on the plaintiff side, this again can be a helpful tool for the plaintiff to understand exactly how this process works. This next document is also prepared by the Wage and Hour Administration. It is 76 pages long, and it gives an employer an overview about how to comply. 76 pages sounds like a pretty long document, but it really doesn't tell the employer the minutia of how the employer is going to need to comply. Or let me put it this way, it tells all the rules, but it doesn't tell the employer, okay, now that these are the rules, this is how you ought to go about doing it. It really obviously leaves it to the employer to decide the mechanics of applying it. And there's lots of different paths. And a lot of the different paths that companies take are going to depend upon how they're structurally organized. Is there a central HR function for the whole company, but that HR function may not be resident in each one of the units? Well, that might suggest one path. On the other hand, there might be little small islands of HR functioning in each one of the units. That may suggest a different method. Or perhaps you have managers who are very involved in the HR function. That may suggest another method. So there's lots of different lots of different paths that companies have taken, and that may inform how you go about doing it. If you have supervisors who, only have responsibility for 20 workers, they may be able to be more hands-on for FMLA. If each one supervises 100 workers, you may find that that's really an overwhelming task to expect them to also do FMLA compliance. So there's just so many different variables. The culture of the company is going to dictate this. But this is a really nice document if you become the expert in your law firm or your legal department about FMLA. This is a really nice document to start that journey on to get into the details. And again, you can see the website for that document is up here. We've already talked about this one. Here is another fact sheet for employer notification requirements. That's what we're going to be talking about in most of this lecture. This is a handy way of also educating the employer about specifically what it needs to do and when it needs to do it and how it needs to do it to be in compliance. And we'll see these will be two forms that we talk about a lot. WH, that stands for wage and hour, 381, and WH 382. All of these are all these documents are available on the DOL website. So let me go back to our PowerPoint now that I've kind of shown you the documents. Okay, so the first document that an employer is typically going to give to the employee after the employee has raised an FMLA coverage issue is the notice of eligibility. The vast majority of really compliant employers are not going to use an oral notification for this, but it's an option. It's the only time you can do an oral notification. And so I think sometimes employers think, well, because I'm allowed to do an oral notification here, I can do it in other situations. But actually, for our other two notices, you have to do it in writing. So I think the best practice is just to ignore this oral and focus on the writing. Even though it is permitted to do an oral notification for notice of eligibility, it's not smart to, because the employee can come back and say, I was never told that. And the supervisor or HR manager can say, oh, I certainly did. But then there's a dispute about what was said. Was it actually said at all? How was it said? And you can see how you really haven't given a notice unless you can prove you've given the notice. So definitely in writing is the way to go. Now, could you use email? Certainly. Something like that would also work. So the employee has raised the issue to somebody in management, maybe his or her supervisor or manager, maybe someone in HR, but somebody in a position who needs to be responsible for it has been told that this employee has a potential FMLA event. Well, let's just talk about how that happens. Usually this is how it happens. Employee calls off sick. He probably calls his direct supervisor or manager. Hey, Sally, I'm off. Let's say his name is Bob and Sally's the supervisor. Hey, Sally, boy, I feel so bad today. I just can't come in. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, Bob. What's up? Just feel terrible. Oh my gosh, I've been throwing up all night, and all over the weekend I was sick too. I just don't know if I can lick this. I may actually end up going to the doctor today to find out what's going on. Oh, well, Sally says, geez, Bob, I hope you feel better. Take care of yourself. Thanks, Sally. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow, but maybe not. Okay. At this point, Bob didn't think he was announcing an FMLA event. Sally perhaps didn't think she was hearing about an FMLA event. But we've heard some information from Bob that points us to FMLA. We've heard that this is his third day of being sick, and we've heard that he's considering seeing a doctor. And so that points to the fact that he may well, in the very near future, have an FMLA event. Notice that he wasn't required to say, I have a serious health condition, and he wasn't required to talk about the Family Medical Leave Act, and he wasn't even required to mention, hey, I think I have some protection here. All he had to do was just say what was going on. And under those circumstances, if he's absent another day, especially if he tells Sally the second day, yeah, I did go see the doctor. He gave me, some pills. I'm hoping they're going to start working pretty soon. That knowledge, 4 days sick, saw a doctor, got a prescription drug, tells Sally it's an FMLA event. Now, Sally isn't thinking FMLA. She's thinking, how am I going to cover Bob's hours? She's not a legal professional. She's not an HR professional. She is a line manager or line supervisor. But we need her, because she's the person Bob's going to call, to be able to connect the dots. Or if she can't connect the dots, to every time call somebody who can connect the dots. And so the notice that we get from the employee might be that type of notice. So that type of notice on that second day when Bob calls in and says, I'm sick, I'm still sick, Sally, that starts our clock for the 5 business days. You could even make an argument that on the third day it was triggered, but definitely, meaning the first day he called in, the third day of the illness, but definitely on the second day Bob calls in, and on the 4th day of the illness, you got a pretty classic FMLA situation here. Bob may not even call during Sally's hours. He may call before Sally comes into work and leave her a voicemail, or he may send her an email message. Or he may leave a message with Sally's secretary or with another supervisor. So sometimes it's even more attenuated than I gave in my example. So the employer has 5 business days to figure this out. So let's say that really it was on Tuesday that Bob told Sally enough for Sally to know it was the FMLA event. And let's say this is a Monday through Friday operation. Well, it will be on Monday where this notice of eligibility has to go to Bob. And so you can see how we're turning things around pretty quickly. And if you have remote HR, you can see how an email to one person and then somebody else has to look it over and then, oh, that person's out sick or that person's on vacation and the email isn't responded to, can easily, pretty quickly get you outside of those 5 business days. So we determine eligibility based upon the first instance of leave for the qualifying reason in the applicable 12-month leave year. Now remember, there's 3 different ways of calculating the 12-month leave year. So sometimes it's going to be that calendar year, sometimes it's going to be a fiscal year, sometimes it's going to be a rolling year. Most employers are going to go with the rolling year. So figuring out if you use a rolling year, it's more difficult for the HR function to manage it. And so you have to figure out, well, where is this person in the notice for this? Has a notice gone out for this in the last 12 months or not? You can't just rely upon a particular set calendar. It's going to be a rolling system. So it does add a level of confusion here. And so as a result, you might have an employee who has a chronic condition, say diabetes or migraines or chronic back pain. In that situation, you may say, oh, I know we've sent this person a notice before. You may have sent this person 5 or 6 notices or more. But the question is, have they got it in the last 12 months? And so that's something you're going to have to check for. Now, some employers choose to send out the eligibility notice every single time. That saves them the hassle of doing this check. That can be a smart approach. Now, we need to send the notice the first time an incident happens. So let's say that Bob breaks his leg in January. And so this eligibility notice goes out in January. In April, unfortunately, he breaks his arm. He hasn't used up his FMLA, so he's still eligible. Well, this is a second incidence. This is a second issue. So this arm breaking, the notice that you send out there is for the first incidence for this particular reason. And so we need to give another notice. So a particular employee might get several notices, if they're very, very unfortunate for that particular year. That person might get several notices in a year. So it's not a situation where one notice every 12 months. It's one notice every 12 months for every single qualifying reason. And it's not at all unusual for people to have more than one reason. Sometimes it's unclear whether this is a separate reason or not. It may be unclear because the employee is unclear. Perhaps the employee isn't sure whether it's the same reason or not. Or perhaps the information the employee shares is a little sketchy. For example, let's say the employee has been experiencing migraines for several years, and he calls up and says, I'm having a brain scan done. Well, the supervisor may assume, oh, this has to do with the migraines. Well, it may be over something completely separate. Perhaps the person is experiencing possibly a brain tumor or something like that, which may have a completely separate cause than whatever is causing the migraines. And so sometimes if the same region is being talked about, you might assume, oh, it's the same reason. Or imagine that you have a pregnant employee. She says, oh, I have a doctor's appointment today. Your assumption might be, oh, she's going to see her OBGYN about her pregnancy, and you chalk it up for that reason. But in fact, she's going because she sprained her ankle, and it has nothing to do with the pregnancy. She might even be going to see her OBGYN because that's the doctor she always goes to, and she wants to get some guidance from him or her because perhaps when she fell, she might be concerned about the baby, but she's really there about the ankle. Well, again, that would be a new qualifying reason. We need to generate a notice. So the supervisor may not be the person best positioned to decide whether we need a new notice of eligibility or not. And as I said, the most cautious approach is to go ahead and issue a new notice of eligibility every single absence. You may burn a few extra trees, but it is the safest path in that area. Now, of course, if you decide that the employee is not eligible, you also need to let the employee know. Now, this gets to be a little bit confusing, because let's go back to our Bob example. So the first day Bob called in, he had not been sick for 3 complete days, and he had not yet gone to the doctor. So he hasn't really said enough yet to make Sally, the supervisor, think that Bob is eligible. On the 4th day, when Bob says he sees a doctor and now he's on his 4th day of illness, then it is necessary that the employer send both a notice of eligibility, if that's what the company is doing, or a notice of non-eligibility. And so when you see the notice of non-eligibility, it can become very complicated. The employee might be like, why did I get this notice? I didn't apply for FMLA. Well, in a sense, you did apply when you gave us information that made us think maybe you are going to be eligible. So you can see how this can be a very complicated situation. Now, the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Administration does give the employers the option of using Form 381. And let me just show you Form 381. You may be thinking, oh, how cool that the government is giving this super cool form to us. Well, it's super confusing form is what it is. So every time that you have one of these events, the employer would have to complete this form. And you can see how detailed and difficult it can be to do. And so it's not necessary that it be this complicated. If you use this form, you are in a safe harbor situation. Obviously, the Wage and Hour Administration isn't going to say, oh, your form was did not provide enough information. But I mean, obviously, if you didn't complete it completely or correctly, that may be the situation, but the form itself is going to be fine. In my experience, we've used a simpler form without so many boxes that can be checked incorrectly and that type of thing. But this is certainly an option. Keep in mind, if you're a large employer, if you've got, say, 1,000 employees, you're going to be doing this all the time. There probably won't be a week that you don't send out several of these a week. So you're going to have somebody who becomes really expert in this particular form and can really know how to fill it out quickly, correctly, completely. And that certainly makes life easier. If your employer only has, say, 70 employees, no, it's not going to be done as often. It'll still be done, a few times a month, but it won't be done nearly as often. And then it requires maybe a little bit more attention to detail to make sure you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Okay, so we said, and again, it's not just a leave request, but it is the notion that the employee has provided enough information for the employer to know the event is FMLA qualifying. Now, as we go through these notices, one thing I think that you will get an impression of is that this whole notice system makes a lot of sense if you're talking about somebody having a baby, or somebody being diagnosed with a very serious cancer, or somebody who's had a heart attack. Truly life-altering events that, thank goodness, aren't tremendously common. I mean, the baby stuff is common, fortunately, but the rest of it doesn't happen every day. And so if FMLA were restricted to those situations, you could imagine, well, the employer is going to, occasionally need to complete this form, maybe, once a month or once a couple months or something along those lines, but it won't be a common thing. So it's okay that we've got all these forms because it's a big deal what's happening in the employee's life. But when you think back to Bob's scenario, sick 4 days with an intestinal bug, and that counts as an FMLA event, you can see very quickly that there's going to be a ton of these events over things that in Bob's mind was, it was a big deal to him at the time because he felt awful, but it's not a big deal in the scheme of Bob's life. And so the HR function is going to be churning out these notices and filling them out and sending them to people by certain dates over things that in Bob's mind was kind of like, huh? Why am I getting all this paper? I just had a tummy ache. What's the deal here? And so sometimes that you have to go back to these folks when these folks are a little bit like, well, what, FMLA? I don't have cancer. I didn't have a heart attack. What are you talking about? And so there is some disproportionality that employees will see with respect to this type of thing. We'll see in the next slide that the rights and responsibilities notice must be in writing. And we'll see on this form, let me just go back to this form. You'll see the rights and responsibilities are actually included within, yes, Section 3, Notice of Rights and Responsibilities. This is actually part of the 381. So we have the Notice of Eligibility at the beginning part, or actually Section 1 is the Notice of Eligibility, and then we have the Notice of Rights and Responsibilities. So the 381 covers both. You don't have to have them in both. And in fact, I would say most employers probably have a Notice of Rights and Responsibilities that they have handy to give out that's separate from this Section 1 section, Notice of Eligibility. And it won't be, the Notice of Eligibility section won't necessarily be exactly in this format. But you absolutely can combine them if those make sense to your organization. This one has to be in writing. The Notice of Eligibility can be oral, but again, and probably the way you'd handle a Notice of Eligibility is, yeah, you may well say it orally, but you also want to put it in writing. Okay, so you only have to give the Notice of Rights and Responsibility when the eligibility notice is required. And again, the 381 accomplishes both. So this is what the Notice of Rights and Responsibilities has to include. You don't have to use 381. If you use it, it will include this. So a statement that the leave may be counted as FMLA, the applicable time period that is going to be used. And again, if you're using the rolling, which is probably what your employer will want to use, and that's what you'll specify. Any certification or substitution requirements that apply, and arrangements for premium payments. For example, if the employee is going to be on an unpaid basis, there won't be any wages for the employer to deduct to cover the health insurance. So the employee is going to have to make arrangements to pay those payments himself or herself. To what entity should he or she be making those payments? A discussion of whether this employee is a key employee, and restoration and maintenance of rights sections. And again, if we go back to this document right here, you'll see that's covered. And this talks about the rolling calendar. So you would check that if that applies. And again, whether you have the key employee. And if the person is a key employee, you have to answer this next question. So these two are related to each other. And then here's the substitution of paid leave, and it explains how that calculation will happen. And then it talks about maintaining health insurance and other benefits and the right to work. So this form can't just be a one-size-fits-all. It has to be individualized for this particular employee's circumstances. Well, you can see, again, you don't have a ton of time to do this. See, I think it is also 5 days. Make sure about that. I don't provide the day here. Again, it's usually issued at the same time as the Notice of Eligibility. So you may want to check to see what the actual Notice of Rights and Responsibilities are, because I don't actually have the date here. But it does require somebody to crunch numbers. Well, does this person have paid leave? How much paid leave does he or she have? If this person doesn't have paid leave and they have benefits, what information do they need to know to maintain those benefits? And of course, if you want to use the key employee designation, then you have to make that statement as well. You're just having a few days to do this, and sometimes these are big decisions to be made, especially with respect to key employee status. And so the decision may need to be escalated to higher levels within the organization. And again, the clock stops for no person, so we have to continue to be moving along within those situations. The employer must provide the required notice of designation within 5 days of having enough information to determine leave as FMLA qualifying. This is tough because to let the person know that we are in fact designating it, we've gotten the information that we need, all within 5 days. And much of it isn't so much that the information is so hard to analyze, but getting the right people to tell the right people the right information. Sally may have 4 different emails or voicemails from Bob. And so she has to put those pieces together. And, the first email she got, she might have thought, oh, Bob's sick. I'm sorry to hear it, but no big deal. Then when she gets a second notice, then she has to think, well, now exactly what did Bob say during his first notice? Because I am on notice for having that information. And I don't remember exactly because I got calls from 4 other people that day. And so reconstructing it, so now Sally has to call Bob back. Bob's not feeling great. He doesn't answer the phone. You can see how things can get pushed out pretty far. So the notice has to include the designation determination. Either this is being designated FMLA or it's not, the amount of substitution of paid leave, and any fitness for duty requirements upon the return of Bob or whomever. And this notice must be in writing. So let me show you that notice. This is the 382. And again, you don't have to use this form, but this is an example or the form that's definitely a safe harbor for you to have. Again, you provide the reason, you say it's approved or not approved, and you have to either say, well, FMLA doesn't apply, or you don't have any leave left, or there might be another reason. Or you can say additional information is required. And this is a place for you to describe that different additional information that may be necessary. Then if it's approved, you have to say, this is how much time is going to count against your entitlement. And you have to explain whether it's paid or unpaid. So again, you can see for just one employee who is absent, you may well have people working 2 or 3 or 4 hours just making these calculations. Now, once your organization becomes a well-oiled machine and you have 2 or 3 specialists who really understand what needs to happen, it may just be 30 minutes per employee or an hour per employee. But still, you're going to have to look up that employee's particular pay situation. And so there will be some work here. As a result, you may find that you need to staff up the HR function. Alternatively, you can have it done by the supervisors. But again, if the supervisor has a large staff, he or she may find he or she is spending an hour or 2 a day just doing FMLA stuff. And this stuff can get complicated really fast, and you really don't want line supervisors messing it up. You don't want anyone messing it up, obviously, but they are, Jacks and Janes of all trades. Do you really want to train them to the nth degree? Train, maybe 50 of them when you could train maybe 2 or 3 or 4 payroll clerks or HR clerks to be able to handle this and have a little bit more consistency. So that would be my suggestion for what it's worth. Okay, the employer, obviously in this notice of designation, has to say what the amount of leave that's going to count against the entitlement. Now, this can be a rolling situation, probably not so much for the tummy ache that Bob had, but when Bob is diagnosed with cancer, you're really not sure how much time Bob is going to need off. Hopefully, the cancer's addressed and Bob's able to come back and as good as new. But it may be that there are complications either from the cancer itself or from some of the treatments. And so there will need to kind of constantly be updated information. If the amount of leave is unknown, and again, many times there's the initial projection about how much leave will be needed, but if it's unknown, because it's just, your employee unfortunately has had a heart attack, who knows how long he or she will need to be off, the employer must inform the employee of the amount of leave designated upon the leave's request. And we also have retroactive designation. Now, retroactive designation is a difficult part of this puzzle. Let's talk a little bit about this. So sometimes what happens is an employee he's sick. He doesn't want to have a 10-minute conversation with the supervisor at that time. So he calls up and says, I'm sick. And it's not maybe until he returns and feeling better that he says, oh yeah, I was so sick. I mean, I know I just missed Monday and Tuesday, but I was sick as a dog over the weekend too. And oh gosh, I went to the doctor twice and, they just couldn't figure out what was going on. But, I woke up Wednesday morning feeling fine, so I came to work. He's probably not thinking he's sharing an FMLA. He's just telling a story, right? And so, but the supervisor hears this and says, FMLA, I just assumed Bob was sick for 2 days, but he was really sick for 4, and he did see the doctor. And so that would be a situation where retroactive designation is appropriate. But designating it after the fact is also tricky because it can sometimes harm an employee. So imagine that you retroactively designate it, let's say a month later. Let's say Bob doesn't start sharing his story of how sick he was over those 4 days until a month later. Well, so Sally first hears that it was an FMLA event when Bob has been feeling fine for 4 weeks. Well, at that time, Bob has also just shared that he's planning on that he and his wife have planned to adopt a child, and he's about to need 12 weeks off to, go to wherever the country or location is to adopt the child and bring the child back and then bond with the child. Well, Sally now has to report the 2 days of FMLA that Bob should have taken. Maybe Bob would have delayed his adoption plans. I mean, 2 days isn't a lot, but that means 2 days less of leave that he's going to be entitled to. So it could be that the retroactive designation does harm the employee in this case because the employee is using his FMLA for another purpose. So retroactive designation is a bit of a dicey situation, especially when you know that the employee is considering or in a position to perhaps need additional FMLA. So it can be done, but it's a good idea to escalate retroactive designations within your organization so there is that extra level of review just to handle these types of situations. As I said before, if the employee is already enjoying health insurance through the employer, those benefits do need to be maintained through the leave period, and they need to be maintained at the active rates. What you shouldn't allow happen is for the employee to fall off benefits because, or not so much fall off benefits, but to require that the employee pay inactive rates. In other words, the COBRA rates, which are usually 102% of the entire premium. Most employers pay about 2/3 to 3/4 of the cost of the health insurance. So if an employee pays $200 a month, probably the overall cost is between $800 and $1,000 per month, with the employer paying the other parts of that cost. If the employee is on FMLA, the employee still needs to pay the $200, but the employer has to continue to pay its share. Now, in the COBRA situation, which we'll talk about in more detail later on, and that would be a situation in which the employee quits, then the employee has to pay all of that premium, oftentimes plus a 2% administrative cost. So let's say the whole cost was $1,000. Well, that employee would pay $1,020. Well, you can imagine if you're sick and you're not working, paying that kind of money is oftentimes not even an option. And so the employee loses benefits coverage in that sense. But if the employee wants to pay at the active rate, the employee does have that option for those 12 weeks. Now, if the employee may still say, I can't even afford that at this time. So what happens in that case is that the employee's health insurance does not continue during the FMLA period, but as soon as the employee returns, the health insurance has to immediately kick in without any kind of waiting period. Most employers have a period of time after a person begins employment, but many times it's 3 months, sometimes it's 6 months, where the employee is an employee in good standing, but is not yet eligible to participate in the health insurance. There's a waiting period. An employee who loses benefits even while he or she is employed, maybe his or her hours drop, for example. That employee, once he or she returns to the status of having enough hours, will usually also have a waiting period. But when the reason that the employee wasn't covered is because of an FMLA event, you can't have a waiting period. You can't make the employee pay the active rate premiums. You can't make the employee pay inactive rate premiums, and you can't have a waiting period when the employee returns. The benefits have to immediately kick in, and the employee has to be given the active rate. So lots of moving pieces there. Your health insurance company, your employer's health insurance company will likely be familiar with all this stuff, so they will help clients that are a little bit unsophisticated in this area. Okay, so let's talk about job restoration. The employee is coming back, fortunately. And so now the employer is going to have to put the employee back in the same or equivalent job. And so these are the things that have to be the same. There has to be an equivalent pay, there has to be equivalent benefits, and there has to be equivalent terms and conditions. So let me give you an example. If I'm a first grade teacher and my room is in my school is room 108. And when I return from my leave, I am still a first grade teacher, but I'm now teaching in room 112, and I have, 20 different students. I would say that that's equivalent. I'm earning the same pay, I get the same benefits, I have the same terms and conditions. But let's say I'm a first grade teacher in room 108, and when I return, I'm moved to room 112, but I'm now teaching 6th grade. I think there's a pretty good argument that that's not the same terms and conditions. And so even though the equivalent pay and equivalent benefits may be in play, the job is significantly different. And it certainly would be different for sure if I were moved, say, to teach the middle school. Even if I have all the certifications and the experience to teach in those areas, I don't think that would be the same or equivalent job. If I am forced to work a different shift, I don't think that would be the same or equivalent job. If I move to a different unit, unless it's next door to it, it's probably not going to be the same or equivalent job. The safest thing for the employer to do is to return that particular employee to the exact same job. That may not always be possible, but it's not just a fairly equivalent job. It has to be a pretty darn close to the same type of job. Sometimes in the middle of the FMLA event, an employer, for completely other reasons, needs to do a reduction in force. Imagine, for example, that during the pandemic, I get COVID-19 and I'm off work for 2 months, 8 weeks. During that time, the employer has to do a layoff, maybe because it's lost a lot of business because of COVID-19, or perhaps for completely unrelated reasons. And let's say the employer decides to completely eliminate my department. In that situation, I am out of a job. I am not entitled to reinstatement in that circumstance because if I had never had FMLA, I would still be out of job. Let me offer another scenario. Let's say that my employer doesn't completely eliminate my department, but it does lay off 30% of the workers. And let's say it does it based upon seniority. Well, I was the most recently hired worker in that particular department. So if I hadn't had the FMLA COVID event, then I would have been laid off for sure. So again, it's appropriate for the employer to lay me off with my, even though I'm on FMLA at the time. But let's say there's a more complicated equation that the employer uses that involves some discretion and subjective evaluation. In that situation, the employer, if it wants to lay me off, is going to have to prove that my FMLA situation was not a factor. That's one of the reasons why employers, when they do layoffs, like to be using as objective of factors as possible, because of course you can have FMLA discrimination just like you can have race or color or religion or national origin or age or all the other types of discriminations. And so you don't want to be in a position where you have to defend subjective answers. Bonuses predicted on specific goals may be denied if the goals are not met. So let's say I am off work and the goal is that I produce a certain number of sales. But because I was off for 8 weeks, I'm still doing a good job when I'm there, but missing 2 months of work can cause a person to obviously have lower sales for the year. So if I don't meet my sales goal under those circumstances, then I can be denied the bonus. Obviously, if I'm a superstar and I'm still able to reach the goal, then I am entitled to the bonus. Perfect attendance or good attendance bonuses can't consider FMLA events. So let's say I had perfect attendance other than the 8 weeks I was off for my FMLA event. Well, I'm still entitled to the $100 perfect attendance gift certificate, even though obviously I had far from perfect attendance. It could well be, going back to Bob's situation, Bob had the intestinal condition for 2 days. He also has migraines, which is also an FMLA event in his circumstances. So he actually missed a total of 20 days over the course of the year. A few days here, a few days there, a few days here, a few days there. And people in Bob's department are always thinking, gosh, Bob missed a ton of days. I get out of bed every day. Why can't Bob get out of bed? They may not even know why Bob is missing, or they may think Bob is exaggerating his condition. Then they don't get the $100 perfect attendance award, but Bob does. You can imagine the morale implications of that. And so a lot of employers have gone away from having meaningful, in terms of financially meaningful, awards for perfect or good attendance, just because it can create kind of these unusual situations where sometimes the person who is least frequently at work is the one who gets the award. We've already talked about key employees, so I'm not going to spend more. Oh, actually, I will spend more time on it. So the key employee has to be salaried, and they have to be in the top 10% of the employees in terms of earnings. Those two things, though, are not sufficient. I mean, they're necessary, but they're not sufficient for an FMLA designation, because in addition, the employer has to be able to demonstrate that restoration of this employee after the FMLA event would cause substantial and grievous economic harm to the employer. That's not going to be true for most of these salaried top 10% folks. Could it be true? It can be true for a few, but this is not going to be the garden variety. And even if it's true, even if you can say, yep, person's salaried, yep, the person's top 10%, yep, substantial and grievous economic harm would happen. Even in that situation, you still can't deny FMLA to the key employee. All you can do, and this is a big deal, but all you can do is deny reinstatement. Because of the fact that you can't actually deny the FMLA, and because this hurdle is so high, most employers, their position is, we're not even thinking about key employee. If the person were sufficiently high that this would be satisfied, probably from an internal politics standpoint, it is not an appealing option to apply the key employee category to that situation, but it is available. Just be sure that employers realize this part of the standard is pretty darn demanding. Okay, so now we're going to talk about kind of retaliation type situations here. Interference with FMLA rights. So employers can't interfere with, restrain, or deny employees' rights. So you can't not grant FMLA when an employee is eligible for it, or somehow make it difficult, unnecessarily difficult for that employee to exercise rights. You can't discriminate against an employee for exercising his or her rights or retaliate against him for that reason. And you certainly can't discharge an employee because he is a witness in an FMLA case or make some kind of complaint about an FMLA. In other words, you can't use FMLA leave in any way as a negative component to any employment decision. This one probably is the one I want to spend the most time on because, as you can see, let's imagine, we'll go back to Bob's situation. Bob has bad attendance. He misses work regularly, and he doesn't always provide a lot of information while he's absent. And maybe his usual way of communicating with Sally is just to leave a voicemail. So Sally doesn't even have an opportunity to ask Bob questions. And his emails typically are kind of terse, or voicemails or your emails are kind of terse and don't provide a lot of information. So these absences have been counted against Bob, and then Bob starts coming forward and saying, well, that was because of my migraines, and that was because of this thing, and that's FMLA covered or whatever. And so when he realizes he's about to be dismissed, he starts filling in the blanks or providing information. And now it becomes difficult for the employer to figure out, are we going to apply retroactive FMLA leave to those situations, or are we somehow or another going to disadvantage Bob in that circumstance? And so oftentimes what employers end up doing is giving the employee extra FMLA. They don't count it against the entitlement, but they also don't count the absence against that employee's attendance policy. So he gets kind of free FMLA under those circumstances. Sometimes employees will become very savvy about this kind of stuff. Obviously, most employees are ethical, honest people who won't do this, but there's in every group, management and non-management, going to be people who learn how to maybe use a system in a way that is advantageous for him or her, but maybe not so ethical. And in this situation, what the smart employee, the sly employee, will say, would be to give relatively little information initially, and then give information later on, so that perhaps they can get the benefits of that FMLA without using up their FMLA entitlement. Generally speaking, once an employee becomes FMLA eligible, it's very difficult to end employment because of poor attendance if the absences are related to either the employee's illnesses or the family member's illnesses. And so, if the employee has chronic car problems, or the employee calls them and says, I slept in, or things like that, yes, you can still act on those. But usually the illness-related reasons cease to be a viable option for dismissal or disciplinary action. And so that, again, can create morale problems in the unit, where you have the good attending people see the people who aren't attending well, and them not experiencing consequences. And of course, it can get expensive in terms of running the business. If you let's say Bob has a unique skill and he's not there to perform that skill, who's going to do that? Do you have to hire another person to fill in for Bob because Bob is so often not there? Again, that can be a challenge for the organization. So what type of records does the employer have to keep? Well, certainly you have to keep records about the dates that the FMLA has been taken. Many times it won't just be, though, a day. It may be that Bob leaves in the middle of the day to go to that appointment, or because he's feeling poorly. And so you're not going to just be able to count days, but also hours, and in fact, even minutes, because you're going to have to track the number of minutes taken based upon the way that you pay hourly employees. So if you look at each minute the actual employee works, or if you look at it in 6-minute intervals or 12-minute intervals, that's the intervals you're going to have to use for FMLA. So if Bob leaves to go to his appointment at 2:56 p.m., then that is the time his FMLA starts at 2:57 p.m. if it's a minute-by-minute payroll system. You'll want to keep copies of all your leave notices to show that you actually did issue those and to show what the information was on those. You'll want to make sure that your documents cover FMLA, the employee handbook, the summary plan descriptions, things like that. You'll need to have records of how the premium payments happen, both the company side and the employee side, and any notices that were given the employee about how to pay those premiums. And if there are any disputes, if the employee says that should have been FMLA, I don't know why it wasn't, any records of those conversations and resolutions with respect to those. So there's a lot of documentation. And not only do these records have to be kept, they have to be kept confidential, because under the ADA, this stuff is medical information, so it can't be part of the employee's personnel file. I mean, some of this can be, but you're probably going to have duplications of it. You may need to have some of the payroll information in the employee file because you need a record of how you paid this person. But that you want to make sure doesn't say, it can say FMLA, but it shouldn't say, FMLA-cancer, for example. So you have to be careful about how you present that information. So let's talk about salaried employees. As we've talked about in other modules, salaried employees by definition are paid a set amount of pay no matter how many hours they work. So as a result, if let's say Bob is now a salaried employee and he takes off Monday afternoon because he's sick, there's no deduction in his pay. The idea is, well, maybe he'll work some more on Monday night, or maybe he'll work extra hours on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. You can't lawfully, under the FLSA, deduct for partial day absences related to illness for employees, except you can when it's FMLA. That's the one exception. So if Bob is out sick for a non-FMLA reason, there can be no deductions under those circumstances. But if Bob is out for an FMLA reason, there can be deductions in those situations. So you can see this is almost the reverse. In this situation, Bob probably doesn't want it to be an FMLA event because he's salaried. Now let's assume that Bob is salaried and he has a clear FMLA event. He breaks his arm, we'll say. He goes to the emergency room, and it's clearly FMLA at that point. Let's say this particular employer doesn't provide him with sick pay, but does give him vacation time. Well, very likely the employer will insist, and probably Bob will want to use his vacation time to fill in for that missed time. But maybe Bob doesn't want that to happen. Well, again, Bob doesn't have the choice. Either Bob or the employer can insist upon PTO or vacation time or whatever the particular employer calls that leave for that time, if it's available. But if there is no leave available, then Bob can be docked pay under that circumstance. He won't be able to be docked paid if it's not an FMLA event. So let's say he goes home just because he has a bad headache, but he doesn't have migraine, so it's not an FMLA event. He doesn't have any other symptom. Non-FMLA event, no deduction. So it's kind of odd that the more trivial the reason for the illness, the more likely it is that there will be no pay deduction. But that's how FMLA works. Here's a little bit of information about employee discipline. I'm going to flag this just briefly because I've already kind of talked about this, but this is the big risk with FMLA. The employer accidentally dismisses or disciplines an employee because of absentee reasons when one or more of the absences that the employer is considering actually should have been an FMLA event. So some tips to keep in mind if this is a major concern for your client is to be aggressive about attendance problems during that first year of service. Usually employees who develop bad attendance develop it in their first year of service. So this gives you a window to go ahead and address it. But that's not always the case. Sometimes an employee develops, say, a drug or alcohol problem, or maybe an issue along those lines, and goes ahead and develops an attendance problem later on, which may or may not be FMLA related. But once that year threshold is covered, the employer is kind of stuck dealing with the FMLA implications. This can be a good strategy, but one problem with the strategy is that the person is still protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it's not, you can't just count every single absence, you kind of universally under those circumstances. But having two attendance policies, one during your first year of employment, one after that, can be a sensible approach. And I recommend that you be very explicit about that. You don't have to mention FMLA, but you do need to make it clear, okay, this is kind of your attendance probationary period, for example. And if you aren't, and let's say you have somebody who has, well, for example, gets pregnant and starts having absences, and your client wants to address those more aggressively, well, if you have in your policy the statement, we've got two policies, one for the first year, one for all the other years, then what appears initially to be an inconsistent treatment of the pregnant employee compared to the long service person who has a heart attack actually isn't inconsistent, because you treat the short service person with a heart attack the same way you treat the short service person who is pregnant. So you have to be clear about that in order to take advantage of that first year kind of haven. After that first year, if you want to take disciplinary action that's going to take money away from the employee, I highly recommend an audit of the employee's attendance for the last 365 days, going through the reasons for the absence, making sure that the calculations were all made correctly. This is tough because days are rolling on, days are rolling off. There'll be some FMLA, there'll be some days that aren't FMLA. There'll be some cases where there isn't a lot of documentation, so you're not sure. All of this, I've audited, hundreds probably of these situations. And I would say more often than not, there's an error in them, even when they're done by careful, well-informed HR people. So you definitely need to make sure that this process is followed. It's time consuming. So, when the manager's coming to you and saying, we got to fire Bob. Okay, hold off. This is going to take a few days for me to go through each one of these occurrences and go through all the documentation and figure out what's going on. We need to wait. And of course, it's very likely that there will be some FMLA in this mix. It's rare that an employee misses a lot of work without there being some reason. I mean, yes, there are some employees who might fall into that category, but if they've survived their first year of employment with you, you obviously think they're doing something okay. And so this is very often a situation where an employer that is too casual about FMLA compliance risks significant liability from dismissing an employee who has at least some FMLA occurrences. Because again, you just need to have one in that group that you are considering. One mistake is going to be enough to sink that dismissal, because but for that one occurrence, that employee would not have been dismissed. Okay, now we're going to talk about employee rights and responsibilities. So this is the other side of it. And here we're going to finally cover element number 5 in that initial list we covered, I think, on slide 3. So here we go. Here's the list. Let me just reflect on this for just a second, because we talked about this early on, but we haven't talked about it lately. And that is, in order for an employee to be eligible for FMLA, we first of all need to establish that the employer is eligible. Remember, we talked about 50 employees within a 75-mile radius. And then we need to make sure that the employee is eligible. And there are actually 3 requirements here. Then we need there to be a qualifying event. Obviously, if it happens to the employee, it's qualified. But it can also happen to somebody in a relatively small circle of the employee's life. And then we have to make sure there's still time left in the FMLA bucket for this particular employee. Now we're up to our final requirement, and that is, did the employee give the employer adequate notice of the need for the leave? And we've kind of talked about this, at least at the edges, but this is one of the big topics we'll be talking about in this section of the lecture. So let me go back to where we are. And here we are, employee responsibilities. And again, this is that number 5, or the 5th requirement. So the employee has to provide sufficient and timely notice of the need for the leave. That's the main concept. If the employer requests it, or requires it, I guess is probably the better word, the employee can also be required to provide certification to support the need for the leave. The employee can also be required to provide periodic status updates and can also sometimes be required to provide fitness for duty certification. For the garden variety, tummy ache and bronchitis, most employers are not going to require this. I mean, employers can, but most are just going to say, give us a doctor's note, tell us what's going on, and leave it at that. But for the more serious long-term situations, especially chronic situations, especially situations in which there's some level of skepticism about the diagnosis, the employer can kind of pull out the big guns. So let's look at what those notice requirements are for the employee. So as I said before, provide sufficient information to make the employer aware of the need for the FMLA qualifying leave. And so again, keep in mind, the employee doesn't have to say magic words. The employee never has to say FMLA, Family Medical Leave Act, I need a leave of absence, I had a serious health condition. None of the words in the statute have to be used. So remember all those reasons we talked about before in the earlier lecture, those reasons. So if the employee says, I need time off for my pregnancy, or I need to see my gynecologist about my pregnancy, the employee's not thinking about FMLA, but the employee told the supervisor or left a voicemail to the supervisor with enough information that he, or in that case she, has satisfied the notice requirement. The request has to specifically reference the qualifying reason or the need for the FMLA for subsequent requests for the same reason. So let's say again we have Bob, who is suffering from migraines now, and he has been approved for his migraines. Well, he'll need to say, hey, I'm off today because of my migraines. We can't require that he get a doctor's note every time that he has a migraine incident. If he just calls up and says, hey, I'm off sick today, but doesn't connect it to his diagnosis, then it wouldn't be an FMLA qualifying event. But again, if he mentions it 2 days later, probably would become under those circumstances. And the employee has to comply with the employer's usual and customary procedural requirements for requesting leave absent unusual circumstances. And this is an important caveat. So if the rule is you got to call your supervisor before the start of your shift to let the supervisor know you're not going to be able to come in, then you can require that for this circumstance as well. But this is a huge qualification. Obviously, we don't want people who are experiencing a heart attack to say, wait a second, ambulance driver, don't take me away quite yet. I need to call my supervisor. No, of course not. We want that person to get the treatment that he or she needs. So there are certainly situations that have an urgency about them where it's just not possible to go ahead and do that. But the employer can say, well, why didn't you do that? And if the employee doesn't have a good excuse, for example, the employee says, well, I couldn't call because my migraine was too bad. Well, don't you live with your spouse? Why didn't you have your spouse call? Or your adult child call if the adult child was there, that type of situation. So this category assumes, again, not the intestinal upset, but it assumes the pregnancy situation or the adoption situation or the person who's having major surgery but not urgent surgery. And so here we see when the leave is foreseeable, the employee should give 30 days notice or as soon as practical if 30 days aren't possible. But the vast majority of these situations are going to be unforeseeable. Nobody plans to have a car accident. Nobody plans to have a heart attack or a stroke. Nobody plans to get COVID-19. And so most of our leaves are going to be unforeseeable. The employer is going to find out about it relatively soon after the employee knows about it, but it may be the morning of the work schedule, and it probably won't be more than a few hours notice at that point. But technically, if the employee knew that he needed to have surgery on his back, but it wasn't emergency surgery, and he was going to need to be off work for 3 weeks as a result, then he should be letting the employer know before the morning of the surgery. But again, it could have been emergency surgery, or perhaps the date was moved up because of an increase of symptoms. So it's pretty rare in my experience to see employers that they may ask for notice, but if notice isn't forthcoming, they usually don't deny the leave, because usually the employee is going to have some argument that it was in some sense unforeseeable. Okay, let's talk about the medical certification form. I'm not going to show you the 380 form. This is the, we talked about 381, 382. The 380 is a form that the Wage and Hour Administration has provided. It is very long and cumbersome, very long and cumbersome. Again, the employer is not required to use it. When I was in private practice, I would recommend a separate form. In that situation, if you use this form, the doctor's office is likely to throw up its hands in frustration when it sees how difficult the form is to complete. And the employee may get a lot of pushback from the doctor's office. And honestly, if the employee is experiencing a major health issue, do we really want to add an extra level of stress and strain to the employee? Oftentimes the employee is already going through a lot of stress and strain. So I recommend not using the Wage and Hour Administration form. But again, employers who want to play a little bit more hardball certainly can, and it is certainly a lawful form to use. So the employee should return the form within 15 calendar days. The employer should look over the form and see if there are any blanks. And again, very often these doctors' offices are not doing the best job on these forms. I mean, they don't really have a lot of skin in this game, and so their attention to detail is oftentimes not what it should be. And usually the doctor isn't the one filling it out. It's someone in the office who may not have sufficient information either about how to complete the form or about what the medical situation is. So if the employer looks it over and finds some deficiency, some blanks, or some incorrect information, the employer has to let the employee know in writing and has to give the employee 7 more days. If this is an ongoing situation, the employer can require recertification every year. The employee is the one that's going to be responsible for any cost, and employers or doctors' offices oftentimes do charge $25, and I've seen even more than that on occasion, to complete these forms. And that's, again, I mean, the employer can pay for it, but most of the time it's going to fall on the employee. Again, this is typically a once-a-year form per diagnosis. But if an employee is saying, well, you know, I got bronchitis in January, I got a broken arm in February, I have migraines in March, et cetera, each one of those is going to require its own form. So it can be quite an involved and sometimes expensive process for that employee. Doctors' offices do not like these forms. Okay, so let's say that the employer has insisted upon the form, the employee has returned it. The employer looks at it and the employer has questions. Oftentimes these questions are, is the form authentic? How do I know that the employee didn't just have his or her spouse or friend actually complete the form? Well, the first situation can be authentication. That can be as simple as faxing the completed form to the doctor's office and just have somebody say, did y'all do this? And you're not asking to confirm any information, just say, is this your writing on the form? And then the second, so this one's a pretty straightforward, just authenticate the document. The second is, hey, we can't read the writing on the form. Many times the writing can be difficult to read, or what the meaning is. It's, you know, it's written in doctor speak. It's abbreviations that don't necessarily make sense outside the medical field. you can't, or the information, they provide some information, but it's not all the information required on the form. Now, this is clarification. This is not expansion. You can't say, well, but tell us more about this. If it is not required on the certification form, the employer can't go back and say, tell us more. Another important thing is that the direct supervisor can't be the one making this call. The best practice is to have somebody who is a doctor or a nurse make this call. And if an employer has a doctor or nurse on its staff, that can be a good approach to, for one thing, the doctor in the office will much more likely treat the doctor or the registered nurse and be willing to talk to him or her much more readily. Number one. Number two, that health expert is going to be in a much better position to evaluate what the doctor says. It doesn't have to be a doctor, especially for the authentication, but this is a difficult journey to make. And keep in mind that if you fill out this form, or if the doctor's office fills out the form, the doctor's office is likely to be on the side of the employee. After all, that is their patient. That's the person they're providing care for. And they may think, correctly or incorrectly, that if they don't fill out this form a certain way, that the employee may lose his or her job. And so they may think of the stakes as being very high. In my life prior to my very happy marriage to my husband, I was involved, dated for several years with somebody who was a doctor. And he would write any note for any of his patients. And his idea was stick it to the man, the corporation. He was a very left of center person. And even despite the fact that he was financially very, very comfortable, he was definitely the underdog proponent. And I would be doing my HR legal thing, telling him, no, you can't do that. That's causing chaos at that place of employment. And he would say, I don't care. So doctors can have all kinds of different stripes. Some won't be that comfortable signing a document that is not really medically appropriate. Others will sign it without a second thought. So there's a range of reactions that you'll have. And of course, employees that are sly are going to find those doctors that are willing to fill out the report the way that it wants to. Let's say, though, you get that first report, you get it filled out all the way, but you don't agree with it. You think it's silly what this doctor is saying. It's very difficult to contest it. The process is that the employer now has to pick a doctor and get a second opinion. The employer has to pay for that. The second opinion doctor is not going to be that comfortable questioning the first opinion doctor. It's a very awkward position for that doctor. So there's not a ton of doctors out there that are going to be super willing to do this, especially not for a lot of money. And of course, it won't just be the $25 copay. The insurance company is not going to cover this. So it's going to be, a few $100s to get a second opinion. And it's going to be, as I say, difficult to persuade the second doctor to disagree with the first doctor, unless it's really a clear-cut case. But even if you can persuade that first doctor to reach a different decision, you're still not done. Now we need the third doctor. And this is a doctor that both the employer and the employee have to agree on. Again, the employer has to pay for the third evaluation. And so now at this point, especially if it was something like, the gastrointestinal infection, well, that employee has been well for weeks. So what doctor is going to say, well, I wasn't able to examine this patient when the patient was ill, but I know for certain that that patient wasn't so ill he couldn't go to work. No doctor ever is going to say that. So, for the short-term absences situation, there's just no really logical chance of being able to use second and third opinions. You can really only use it possibly effectively when you have a dubious chronic condition diagnosis. And even then, again, if it's a chronic condition that kind of flares up and goes away, a doctor is unlikely to say, well, when I saw the patient, there was no flare-up, but I can't say there wasn't a bad flare-up on other occasions. So the second and third opinion route is legally available, but it's not one that is likely to be that helpful for employers. Let's talk about recertification. So an employee has been out for a while. You can request recertification no more often than every 30 days. If the minimum duration of certification is greater than 30 days, the employer must wait until the minimum certification expires. The employer may request recertification every 6 months. Now, this is different than the notice of eligibility. So again, we've got another form to think about. So notice of eligibility says, for this particular illness, for this particular absence, you're eligible overall, your employer is eligible. But now we're going into, oh, I need more time for this particular illness. For example, imagine somebody has a broken leg and it was a bad break. They initially thought was, well, this person's going to need 8 weeks off. And now, oh, they're hearing, well, this patient needs 4 more weeks off. Well, this might be a situation where recertification can be required. When the employee fails to provide the required certification, the employer may deny FMLA until the certification is received. This gets tricky though, because presumably the employee is not going to work during this time. And so if you, so let's say the employee tells the employer, hey, I need time off starting March 1st. And the employer says, okay, we need certification. The employee doesn't provide it, but the employee actually does go ahead and have the surgery on March 1st. And the employer doesn't count it against FMLA. Then the employee provides the form on March 15. So at that time, FMLA kicks in. Well, what are you going to do with the first 15 days? You could make it retroactive FMLA. That's probably what most employers do. You can make it kind of the free FMLA that's not going to count against the entitlement if you're concerned that this is going to do a harm to the employee. You could even potentially count it as an absence. But especially if the employee can make an argument, well, I tried to get my doctor to complete the form, but he just wouldn't. That's a difficult argument to then terminate an employee because he was doing everything he could, and it was the doctor who was making things difficult. So most employers probably make it retroactive to the date that the absence began. The employee has to respond to the employer's request for information about his or her status and intent to return to work. This happens when the employee is off for a significant period of time, and the employee kind of just drops off the planet, so to speak. The employer leaves voicemails, they're not responded, sends emails, they're not responded to. At some point, the employer says, well, I think this employee's moved on. And what that line is, it can be difficult to know. It's a good idea to communicate multiple times in multiple ways. A registered letter, email, voicemail, even home visits can make sense. Especially if the employee is at home, or you think he's at home, then presumably he will answer the door under those circumstances. And also talking to family members can be an appropriate way to handle this situation. And then eventually, before you actually end the employment, you ought to escalate it and start saying, if we don't hear from you by, and give him 3 or 4 days to respond, we will be assuming that you have moved on with your life and you no longer are interested in continuing your career with your employer. We wish you every success and best wishes. If we don't hear from you, your employment we will acknowledge your resignation in our personnel system on this date, or something along those lines. Okay, so let's talk about fitness for duty certification. This can be another employee responsibility, so that's why I have a number 5 here. So let's assume that we've got through all of the certification necessary for the employee when the absence began. Now the employee is ready to return to work, and sometimes there can be concern that this employee may not be able to perform at the level that he or she needs to, or may be at risk of harming himself or herself. So employers are permitted to require a fitness for duty certification. You ought to have a consistent policy in this area, that you apply it routinely to employees. Obviously, if you have a collective bargaining agreement or you have a state or local law that applies, you're going to want to follow that. Texas does not have any state laws in this area. You can't use a fitness for duty for those intermittent or reduced schedule leave because the person has never actually left. The only time you can do it if there are reasonable safety concerns. So let's say the doctor says Bob can only work 20 hours a week given his situation, even though his job is ordinarily 40 hours a week. Typically, the employer can't say, well, we're concerned he can't work any hours a week given his situation. We want a fitness for duty evaluation so that we can confirm that 20 hours a week is appropriate. Ordinarily, the employer can't do that. If the doctor had said Bob needs off 4 weeks completely, and then he can return full-time or part-time or whatever, that's when the employer can say upon the end of those 4 weeks, yes, we need a fitness to return to work in that sort of scenario. The employee is going to be responsible for the fitness for duty certification if there's going to be any cost associated with that, and typically there's going to be. The same rules about authentication and clarification are going to apply for the fitness to return to duty situation as well. So now we've completed both the employer rights and responsibilities and the employee rights and responsibilities section. And we have completed all 5 of our entitlement for FMLA leaves. The only thing we haven't covered yet are going to be the military part, which we'll be covering in our next lecture. I hope that this information has been helpful for you. Of course, as always, if you have questions about the material, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'll be glad to answer those questions during my office hours. I thank you for your attention and have a wonderful day.